This brings me to a question which is very hot in Germany today, because if you have systems, this can be households, this can be as well companies or small business operators who increasingly supply themselves with their own electricity, and if they add storage really, they can easily go to 90% of own power consumption. What plans do you consider right now in order to charge for staying connected to the grid? Are you thinking, like in Germany right now, to place a tax, a surcharge on own produced electricity? Or do you think to go to a capacity market where you have to pay, if you want a 5 kilowatt connection, you pay less than if you demand a 10 kilowatt connection from the grid? What are the plans?
Yeah, I mean, some of those are bounced to my colleagues on the rate issues. But I remember back in the first Brown administration, one of our key initiatives, along with energy efficiency and renewables, was cogeneration, combined heat and power. And that's a very significant part of our load in California. And ultimately, what it took to make that happen is we had to have in place a requirement for a fair interconnection from the utilities, fair price for backup power, and a fair price for the value of the power. And for the backup power, I remember in my original debates with the utilities, they wanted to assume that every single cogeneration project went down at the peak time and then allocate cost. Well, in fact, there was a lot of diversity there. And so once you looked through that, you could come up with something that was fairly complicatedly modeled, but deal with the diversity of when they would call upon it. Now, obviously, you've got similar phenomena as you look more at, say, solar on the distributed side in terms of when are they really going to call for the backup. But again, a lot of our infrastructure in California, gas and electric, came from that sort of 50s. And so a lot of it is at the stage now, it's going to need to be replaced. We want to replace that in a very smart fashion. But it's a very substantial bill that everyone has to pay their fair share.
But you don't think about a surcharge of own produced electricity, right?
We don't look at this in terms of a surcharge, particularly given the way that we structure our rates in California. We bury the cost of the grid in the average cost of use of electricity per unit. I think what we will start to see over time is breaking out the cost of the grid and the wires as a separate cost. So I was the director until a month ago of a public utility owned by the community that actually did charge for the use of the grid, up to $20 a month over time. And so I think that you're starting to see that trend. As you do that, of course, then the per unit cost of electricity starts to drop. Then some of the value proposition for individualized power generation starts to shift too. And you start to get a slightly different take on who and where. But it does start to answer the question of who will maintain the system that supplies that additional 10% of the electricity, which is probably larger in California during the peak summer months. I think it also starts to put more value into actually using that expensive distribution and transmission system that we're paying for and optimizing that as well as part of the overall resources. And so I'll go back to my discussion about how a smart grid can not only start to balance need, but it can actually start to supply those resources throughout a community so that there's a little bit more buy-in to your neighbor's solar panels and to a community solar array, because you all understand you're paying your share of the grid and then you're benefiting from the over-generation of your neighbors. But I think that that's a market transition, it's a business transition, and it's a regulatory transition. And of course, phasing those three entities to actually think and do things differently is 3 times or 9 times harder than simply one.
Yes. Please, Carla.
Yes, no, I'll also add, I think it's an important question for Germany to be having, but most importantly, you need to be having a conversation about it, a conversation amongst the legislature, the developers, local governments. And this past summer, our legislature passed a bill which gave our Public Utilities Commission more authority to consider adjusting our rates. Because as Michael has noted, we're having technology innovation. We can't be afraid to have rate innovation and regulatory innovation. And also, we're having to deal with these issues because of our success. And just to put in perspective, a rooftop solar is less than 1% of our generation right now in California. So it's really still at a relatively small scale. So it's a good time to start thinking about what does your model need to look like as you evolve, and not be afraid to have that conversation, but take the time to have it thoughtfully.